Hey guys, I've got a few small leather projects to work on today, so I figured I'd take you along and see how I do it and what I'm working on. Two of the projects that I want to work on today are, we have this hatchet that I put a new handle on, and I've already put a lanyard on it, but it came with this really cheesy rubber sheath that just falls off and gets lost all the time anyway. So I want to get a leather sheath on the hatchet, and I'm going to go with something really simple that the blade falls into and then snaps closed. So all I'm going to need is maybe some rivets, or maybe I'll stitch it, I'm not sure yet, a snap and a couple small pieces of leather. And then the main project that I'm going to be working on is, I've got this old knife that came from Marilyn's dad, so it's going from him to her, and because it's kind of a family thing, I want to keep it as original as possible. The knife is kind of in rough shape, the rivets are coming out, the bone is really dirty, but it's a high carbon steel knife with a full tang. It's a nice knife, it just really needs to get reprofiled, sharpened, cleaned up. But that'll be a different project. For this project, I want to work on the knife sheath, which is really old. The leather is dry rotting. The stitches are all dry rotting and coming undone. And the leather's just in rough shape. I want to recreate this. I want to keep it as original as I can. So I'm going to need 5 or 6 rivets, a snap, and a few leather pieces, and I'll show you how I do my leather stitching. Usually I would make a much more complete sheath. I like to make bushcraft sheaths that have an area where I can put my striker, an area where I can maybe put tinder in, and I'll show some examples of those type of sheaths that I've made in the past. But because this is kind of a family piece, I want to keep it as original as possible. So the first thing we're going to need to do is kind of not disassemble, but look at what we have here and draw a pattern for it. So the first thing I want to do is get out a piece of graph paper, and I'm going to trace out the original sheath just so I can get the size and shape that I'm going to be cutting my leather. And this doesn't have to be super accurate yet, because this is just going to let me find the size of the pieces that I'm going to need of leather. I'll do a much more accurate trace onto the leather before I cut it. Now for some projects that I do that are repeatable, I'll make a much nicer pattern. I'll write on the pattern what it was for, and I'll file it. I have a binder where I keep patterns that I make over and over. But because this is kind of a one-shot deal, I'll make a pattern for it. I'm probably not going to keep the pattern when I'm finished. But because I want the new sheath to be as close to the original as possible, but with new leather, new rivets, and I may actually do something a little bit different for where the belt loop goes. On this one here, it's just a couple of slits that are cut in the leather, and this one is ripped, and that style has a tendency to rip. So I'm probably going to redesign that slightly, but in the end it's going to look just like the original one. So once I get this traced out, I'll have an idea of how much leather I'm going to need to work on this project. I'll be tracing out this front piece of leather, the back piece, and this strap that's used to retain the knife. I'll get all those traced out, and then I'll find some leather, I'll get it cut, and then we'll move on to the next step. Well, I finished tracing everything out, and then I labeled what all of the pieces are. So I have a front piece, the back piece, a strap to retain everything, and then also a couple of spacers, and I'll show you what those are going to be for. I noticed on the original one where the knife goes into the sheath, it's held open slightly by a couple of extra pieces of leather, so that's what these are, but you'll see it when it all comes together. So my next step is to find some pieces that I want to use that are these sizes, get those traced and cut out, and once I get those cut out, I'll show you what the next step is. Alright, so I got my pieces cut out, and now what I'm going to do is just put everything together the way it's going to go together, so you can kind of get a better idea of what we've got going on here. These spacers basically are going to go in here, and then the front piece goes on, and what those do is they separate the leather enough that you can get the blade in there. It kind of opens it up a little bit towards the top, and then this will be folded over, and then the retaining strap will be right here, and this will get folded and a snap will be put on it. So when we're done, this will be our design. So now what I need to do is make a few cuts in this leather for the strap to go through, use a hole punch to punch where I'm going to be putting the snaps and the rivets, and marking along the edge here where my stitches and rivets are going to go. Once I get all that marked out, I'll show you how I drill my holes for stitching, and I'll show you how I use wax dental floss to do all of my leather stitching. So now that I've got everything marked out, where all of my stitches are going to go, and where I'm going to put in those rivets, I just marked it on the front because it's really the only place I need to see that. I also cut the slots and put the retaining strap through. I marked where I'm going to be punching a hole for the snap, and I've punched a hole to retain the strap in here, and I did that ahead of time because what we're going to do next is kind of fold everything down the way it goes, put all the pieces together, and then use a rubber cement to kind of glue it all together before we start stitching. That'll hold it while we're working on it. And once that's done, I won't be able to get in here to do this rivet. So that's the next thing we need to do. And I just use a simple hole punch, pop a hole in the leather. I've got my little anvil here, I'll put that down. I'm going to stick the rivet through the hole. I'll put the cap on the back of the rivet, and then I'll just set the rivet real quick. And that's all set. So now I can move on to the next step of gluing all of this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just apply glue around the edge on both halves of the leather, and once it has set to it being a little bit tacky, I'll press the pieces together, and then I'll use these metal clamps to clamp everything down and hold it all in place. Well, I got it all glued up and put together. I used binder clips to clip it just to hold it until the glue has a chance to set up the rubber cement. And once that's done and it looks like things are holding together well, I'm going to use a drill and just drill out all of my holes for stitching this right around here. The other thing I wanted to finish ahead of time, just to get it out of the way, was I punched holes in the retaining clip and put the snap in. And this is just the snap for the knife when it goes in here. So really all we have left is to stitch, put a few retaining rivets in, clean up the edges, and stain it, and we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. But like I said, once this is dry, we'll drill it and move on to the next step. So now that we got all of the holes drilled and I punched out where the rivets are going to be going, the next step is to stitch this up. And the way I do my stitching is I use waxed dental floss, like unflavored, unscented dental floss that's been waxed. You can use whatever. They do make different product for this. You can even use something that's natural. I've always used it. It's very strong and the wax does help it as far as your sewing goes. But the way I measure the amount I'm going to need is I go from my starting point all the way around where I'm going to be stitching. I take that amount and I double it, and then I double it one more time. And it may be a little bit more than I need, but it's worth it, because if you don't start with enough and you have to add more stitching, you're gonna hate yourself in the morning. So let me get my thread measured out and cut, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now that I've got my thread cut out, I'm just going to thread one end of it onto the needle, and maybe a couple of inches of extra. I'm just going to fold that over because we're just going to use this as a single thread. Something that may come in handy would be a thimble, and that would be if you have to really shove the needle through the leather. I haven't got to that point yet, so hopefully my holes are big enough to allow for this. Now I'm going to start my stitching from the back, because what we're going to do is stitch all the way down and around, and then we're going to come back in the opposite direction and end at our starting point. So that's where the knot is going to be. And to keep it a little bit more hidden, I'm going to put it in the back of the sheath. And you'll see what I mean once we get started. But I'm just going to put it through the first hole, and then I'm going to stitch down into the next hole. And then I'm going to come back through the next hole, and it's really that simple. And then once I get all the way around to this side, I'll show you how I'm going to come back the other way. So I finished my first pass all the way around, and as you can see, it's just a simple, I don't know if this is called a whip stitch or a straight stitch or an inline stitch. I'm sure there's other patterns that you can do, and a lot of that's just to your liking. But this is just a straight run all the way around. And now what I'm going to do is go back through in the opposite direction. So basically closing up these gaps, so it will be stitched across all of these gaps now. So just going through the opposite direction and heading back the way we came. And here's where a thimble may come in handy, because now it's going to start getting a little bit tighter because you're stitching through where your first pass of stitches just came from. So the holes are going to start getting a little bit tighter. So I'll get this finished and I'll show you what this looks like when it's done. I finished coming back all the way around, and as you can see now, all those open loops are closed on both sides. And for anybody who thought maybe 4 times the length was going to be way too much, that's all I've got left. I was starting to sweat a little bit towards the end, worried that I wasn't going to make it. But now I've got the original tag end where we first went in, and then what we have left. And I'm just going to knot this together. And then once this is knotted, I'm just going to do a simple square knot. And to be honest, you can do whatever knot works for you. I'm going to do a square knot, and another advantage to using floss is floss is generally made out of a nylon. So now that I have it knotted, I can cut these ends here, and I can use a lighter and just melt those tag ends down. And you can't do that if it's a cotton thread or if it's an actual a natural fiber from either animal or plant. But with nylon, you can melt it and it makes it nice and pretty. So then the next thing after we get this end cleaned up is to put our rivets in these oversized holes. So we'll get those rivets in and I can show you where we're standing at that point. Okay, I'm just pressing the stem end of the rivets through the holes. And I'm only really doing this so that it matches the older one. I understand why they're here for reinforcement. I don't know if it's really necessary on a knife this small, but I want to keep the kind of aesthetics of the original sheath on our remake here. Now the hard part of this is slipping this through the hole that we just stitched through, having to get it past the threads, and doing it so that I'm not breaking the threads either. I mean, they're not easy to break, but that's why I don't want to force this rivet too much. If I push too hard, I don't want to damage what we just threaded. So I'm going to continue getting these rivets in. I'll hammer them closed from the other side, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. The next thing I need to do is clean up the edges. Some of the leather is overlapped slightly. There's a little bit of loose leather from when it was cut, little nicks. I'm going to clean all that up just using a piece of sandpaper to go over the edges. And for all those hard to reach spots, I'm going to use this nail file I stole from Marilyn. It works great getting into all these hard to reach spots on the strap where it's a little bit smaller. Once I get this sanded down and cleaned up, we'll move on to the next step, and that'll be shaping the leather around the blade. And in case you're wondering, I had mentioned earlier the lid of the tote where I keep all my leatherworking stuff is what I use for a work surface. So that's this nasty thing that I'm working on here. It's covered in cut marks and stain. It kind of keeps my mess contained so I won't get yelled at for destroying the kitchen island. Let me finish this up and we'll move on to treating it with some water. So now what I've done is I got a container big enough to contain my project. I filled it with just hot water out of the sink, hot enough that it's steaming. I can get my hands in it, but it's hot water. I'm going to take my leather and I'm going to just dunk it right into the water, and I'm going to kind of press it until the bubbles stop. Once there's no more bubbles coming off of it, it's wet enough. You don't want it to get overly saturated. And it really should only take a few seconds. Okay, I'm not seeing any more bubbles coming off of it, so I'm going to pull the leather out. And this is going to make it a little bit more pliable. So now, what I've done is I took the knife and I wrapped it in plastic wrap or cling wrap, kitchen wrap. I just did this to slightly thicken it up a bit and also to protect it from the water. I don't want it to get all wet and rusty. So now I'm going to take this and just kind of force it into position here. The plastic is going to increase the size of it just a little bit. So once this is dry, the knife will actually fit even a little bit better. Then I'm going to take my retaining strap here and snap it closed. And the idea is I want this now to dry in its finished form. So once it's dry, I can take this knife out, unwrap the plastic, and it should fit in here beautifully. At this point also, if you want to do any kind of decoration on this by embossing a design into the leather, you do it when it's wet and soft. You can use a piece of wood sharpened like a pencil, some kind of the backside of a pen, whatever you want to use to kind of form the blade around the blade. Or if you have a stamp that you want to stamp some kind of a decoration into the leather, or initials, or whatever it is you're going to do. This is the stage where you do that while it's wet and it can hold that form. Once you have that done, put this someplace warm to dry. You can either let it dry at room temperature, but it won't really harden up the leather. The faster you dry the leather, the harder it's going to get. But you don't want it to dry out. So don't put it in an oven where if your lowest temperature is, say, 150 degrees. That's just too much heat. If you could put it someplace warm, you can put it in an electric oven and turn the light on in the oven, and that should, just the light bulb in the oven alone should raise the temperature to almost 100 degrees. That can work. I'm going to put it in our bread warmer on our wood stove. I know that gets to about 110, and I'm going to let it dry there. And once this is dry, we'll open it up, take the knife out, and I'll show you where it is. It's dark now because it's wet. It's going to lighten up a little bit more when it's dry. At that stage, if we want, we can do a final sanding on it to really smooth it down. We can brandish the edges with a wax. We can stain it or just put our final touches on it. But for right now, it's going to go in the heat, and then I'll come back to you when that's ready. The sheath finished drying. So now all I need to do is pull the knife out, and I'm just going to unwrap this. It dried up and held its shape good, and now the next step is to stain it. I went over a few different stains with Marilyn and had her pick the one that she wants as far as the color goes. So we'll just be staining that, and then when it's finished, I'll condition it. It'll be all set. But now, just to test this out, the knife slides right in without any problems. The wrap not only protected the knife, but it did stretch the leather slightly bigger than without the plastic. So that way everything, even though it retains it, it still slides in easy enough that it's usable. You don't have to fight with it to make it go into the sheath. So now all I have to do is put a rubber glove on or two, and we'll stain this up. I'm going to be using a Minwax wood stain, and you can do that. They do make leather stains which have like a conditioner in. They penetrate the leather better than a wood stain will, but it's the same stain, and as long as it's an oil-based stain like a Minwax, you can use those. And I find they're easier to get my hands on. I don't have to order them from a specialty shop. I can just go to the hardware store and pick out a color that I know I like. Before you do any staining on a project though, use some of the scrap that was cut off of your project to test the stain to make sure that it's the color that you're looking for, because with leather you can go with a very light yellowy pine on wood, and you put it on leather and it'll come out a baby puke brown. So always test the stain first before you put it on your project, because it is a stain. So once you do it, it's there, and it's very difficult to correct a mistake like that. Well, I used a stick and stirred the stain I'm going to be using. It's a red mahogany, and I'm going to use just a little makeup sponge to apply it, and as soon as the stain is on the leather, I'm going to use this old sock just to kind of wipe it off. I don't need to leave it on here. It's going to absorb very quickly into the leather, so it's not like I have to leave it on here for 5 minutes before I wipe it down. And you'll see how quickly this goes. So I'm just going to give a quick coat to the front. Okay, and then I'm going to wipe it. And it does a very even job. Now, I had read someplace that wood stain actually is better for not streaking when you're using it on leather. I don't know how true that is, but I don't end up with any streaks at all or strokes in the stain. It's a very even color. So let me finish this up. I'm going to make sure to get all around all of the edges. I'm going to try to get inside a little. Anything that shows, I'm going to try to stain. And then I'm going to wipe it down, and then when it's all finished, I'll show you what it looks like wet, We'll let it dry, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's finished. Well, I finished staining. I made sure to get all around the edges, the back, the front, both sides of the strap. I had Marilyn look over my shoulder and make sure I didn't miss anything. Once everything is hit, I'm just going to put this someplace to dry, and it'll take maybe, I don't know, with the fire going, probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I'm going to leave it probably for about a half an hour or so. Once it's dry, we'll move on to the next step, and that's really conditioning it and putting a little bit of wax just to seal it and make it a little more outdoor friendly. And then it'll be a done project. The only thing left to do will be to fix up the knife, and that'll be for another video. But I've also been working simultaneously on the other leather projects, so at the end of the video I'll kind of show you everything that I've done. But let's let this dry and move on from there. Now that the stain is dry, I'm going to use some kiwi mink oil. Just get a little on a rag, and I'm going to rub that over all of the edges. I'm going to rub it all over the surfaces, and I'm going to keep putting it on until it looks like the leather is done drinking it up. I really want to saturate this leather as much as I can just to keep it conditioned and not dry out. And then when I'm done with that, we'll just rub a little wax around the edges just to seal up any of the seams and any of the edges, and that'll protect it that much more from the weather. So I'm going to get this done, and then we'll come back and wax the edges. The last thing that I'm going to do, but it's really not necessary, I'm going to take this votive candle and I'm just going to rub it along the edges, anywhere there's a seam, and it just helps to kind of finish the edges a little bit more and get everything sealed up. Once I'm done rubbing the candle, I'm just going to kind of burnish the edges a little bit with, I've got this dowel that I use for leather working that I'm going to rub the edges with, and just really kind of grind the wax into those seams and into the edges, and that will pretty much finish up the project. It was a fun little project to do this. Also, any other little projects that you can do yourself, it'll save you a little bit of money, and it teaches you another skill that you can use, and also gives you a little bit of pride knowing that you made it yourself. I said I'd show you the other projects I was working on in the background while I was working on the knife sheath. Also wanted to get a sheath made for the Hatchet. So this rubber bumper that came with the Hatchet got replaced with just a simple sheath for the Hatchet. I did that out of a suede. I didn't do any stitching. It's just riveted at the end and has a snap on it to close it. And all of that is made from one piece of leather that was just kind of designed, folded in half, riveted on one edge. Simple project, but it's much better than the rubber guard that was on the edge before, and it also, I think, looks better than just a black piece of rubber. But then the other project I worked on was, we'll call this a sheath as well. I'm not going to stain or wax this. It doesn't really have to be pretty. It's meant to be concealed anyway. And it was something I wanted to make for myself just for a little more comfort. And I can also say that I made it rather than going out and buying one. It was molded and it fits perfect. I've already tried it on. It's very comfortable. And that was another project I did. So these are all different things to keep in mind rather than going out and buying stuff. Sometimes it's more fun, sometimes it's more expensive, or sometimes it actually can save you a few pennies. But you can always learn something by doing it yourself. And also you can feel good that it's something that you created rather than just go out and buy. A few other things that I've made in the past are, these are just phone cases that you can put on your belt. No longer have the phone for it, so It's used just for a collection case, a belt case, like for a utility type belt. And it fits 2 secret size tins. This was another phone case that no longer have the phone, so it was repurposed as a fire kit that Marilyn uses. It fits her large ferrocerium striker. It also has a little tab that you can pull to take out her tinder boxes, and it holds 2 secret sized tinder boxes as well, so she can fill this up with everything she needs. And again, it's a belt pouch that used to be a phone case and just got repurposed. But if I need a phone case, I usually make it myself, or if I need some kind of kit or gear, I'll make that myself. And these are the type of patterns that I save, because I can always just remake these knowing that they fit what I'm using them for perfectly. A couple of other things that I've made are another belt-worn haversack. It's a small foraging pouch. And this is actually made out of an old weightlifting belt and a pant leg off of a pair of canvas pants. So it's just a drawstring pouch that's mounted on a piece of leather that can fold up nice and neat, and you can just wear this on your hip. And if you're out hiking or foraging, whatever you find, you can just pop this open, and you always have a bag right there on your hip that you can put what you're collecting into. So I've made a few of those. Me and Marilyn usually wear these if we're out on a hike, just in case we run into mushrooms or anything else that we want to forage for. I know I said I wasn't crazy about this style of sheath because of it being as basic as it is, but I think it actually turned out kind of nice. So this project is pretty much done. The sheath is finished. I think it came out pretty good. The modification I made, rather than the slits for the belt loop, I just extended this piece of leather a little longer and folded it over so that I have a solid belt loop to go through. It's much stronger. I don't think it really took away from the original look of the sheath. It just, in my opinion, made it a little bit better. And because I like this, I did save the pattern for it. So it's been added to my binder of patterns. It's a little small for another knife I have. This used to be my dad's Navy knife, and it was handed down to me. And rather than keeping it in its original case, and I'm not sure what this is, some kind of a fiberglass in steel, I probably am going to make it the same type of case, just extend it a little bit longer and shape it a little bit different for this particular blade. But use the same design, use the same pattern, just make some small modifications. The old sheath, Marilyn was thinking maybe she could forge a small neck knife, so maybe stay tuned for that video. And then utilize the old leather. If we can take this apart and condition the leather so that it's still decent, make a small sheath for a neck knife that she can use. And that way she still has the original knife and she still has pieces of the original sheath. Sometimes if you can't fix something, repurposing it for another use is another option. Thanks for tuning in and watching. If you like this video or leatherworking videos or any of the other projects that we work on, make sure to comment below and give us a thumbs up. Share it with your friends if you think that they'd like our videos, and I'll see you in the next video.